Zero prospect that that's going to pass anytime soon. Even if it did, it's easy to repeal. It's a flaw of our constitution. I have zero sympathy for anybody who thinks the British constitution is a good thing. It's not. But at the same time...
Supposedly, a number of government departments and senior secretaries of state are basically refusing to agree spending cuts with the Treasury. And that's quite a remarkable thing.
Taxing capital is far more damaging and far more difficult than taxing labour because it's more mobile.
Hello and welcome to the Institute of Economic Affairs podcast. I'm Tom Clougherty, Executive Director here at the IEA, and I'm joined this week by two of my colleagues, Kristian Niemietz, our Editorial Director, and Harrison Griffiths, our International Programme Manager. As always, our goal is to bring you a current affairs podcast with a difference. We want to go beyond the headlines and shallow political commentary you'll get elsewhere, and instead focus on the big ideas and underlying principles that matter to classical liberals. This week, we're going to be talking about young people and specifically how libertarian or not are they. We're going to be talking about the UK's upcoming budget and rumours of up to £40 billion of tax increases on the way. But first, we start with a tricky question. Harrison, has thought crime arrived in Great Britain?
Apparently so. I very rarely read stories where I find myself incensed. I've kind of adjusted myself to the bad state of things in this country, but this is a real doozy. So a man named Adam Smith Connor from Bournemouth.
He's actually called Adam Smith.
Adam Smith Connor, yes, this is true. It gets worse and worse.
Okay.
He has been convicted of violating an abortion clinic buffer zone in Bournemouth. And his violation in this case was standing out of sight of the abortion clinic behind a tree and silently praying. Now, he was very much there with the intention of protesting in some small way against abortion. He's a Catholic campaigner, but he was standing there minding his own business, out of sight, out of mind, until a group of police officers came up and started asking about the nature of his thoughts. This happened previously. I've actually written about a previous case where this almost happened for the Foundation for Economic Education over in the States, where a woman called Isabel Vaughan Spruce was arrested for basically doing the same thing in the West Midlands, silently praying near an abortion clinic. And fortunately, the West Midlands police ended up conceding 2 cases of wrongful arrest against her, and we thought this was a win against the prospect of thought crime coming to the UK. Fortunately, this is a setback. A man has been criminalised and basically forced to pay £9,000 in legal fees because he silently prayed.
I mean, Kristian, what do you make of this? I don't think you have to be anti-abortion to think that there's something pretty wrong going on here, right?
Well, that's the whole problem. I think there was a time, unless I'm somehow romanticizing it in hindsight, when I think most people would have understood that if you defend somebody's freedom to say something that doesn't constitute approval of the content of it in any shape or form. But that principle seems to have gone completely out of the window. And that's why in a case like that, few people would be prepared to defend it because, well, being anti-abortion, at least in this country, it might be different in America, but at least here in Europe, it's very low status to be anti-abortion. And that's why, nobody would want to defend this man in a situation like that. But then I'd also say this isn't even the first example of somebody being, of thought crime being a concept. There was a court case, I think last month, which ended the other way. A group of activists were accused of, was it racially aggravated, something, whatever the legal term is, because they had used the term coconut to describe, I think, Rishi Sunak and Suella Braverman. Coconut, for those who aren't social media addicts, is basically a slur against non-white people who, have non-woke opinions. That's basically what it is. The accusation is you're brown on the outside, but actually white on the inside. You may look brown, but you're acting like a white person. That's the accusation. In this case, they were acquitted because, the ruling was they meant it in a progressive way. It wasn't phrased like that, but that's basically their defense was, oh no, we mean it in a good and woke way, and therefore it was fine. So in this case, okay, it ended the other way, but this was very much the court investigating what is the thinking behind this. are they committing a thought crime or not?
Yeah, and it's what makes this so much more concerning. As I said, it is utterly enraged me. The government has anything to do with the contents of anybody's speech, never mind their thought. But what makes this all the more alarming in this case is, as Kristian said, being pro-life in the UK is an extremely marginal, unpopular, low-status opinion. Right? This isn't America. There's no real movement to speak of. It's so marginal. And therefore, it's easy. It's easy to attack these people because they are weird and Catholic and anti-abortion and all isn't that very antiquated and old-fashioned. It's
to be clear, these are not necessarily your views you're expressing here.
No, certainly not. And, a little bit because I really have zero sympathy for Catholic religious fundamentalists, right? You know, these guys are against a whole host of things that I think, are ridiculous to be against. But it's their right to speak. And this is just yet another small milestone on our path to, speech and expression serfdom. It's the natural progress of the slippery slope that we've been going down for probably about 40 years now when it comes to free expression in the UK. Just these incremental attacks on people's right to think and say things that are not approved of by the establishment, that make people feel a bit uncomfortable. Look, it's public property, and so far as public property, exists, it should be run with free speech principles in mind. And if they want to stand there with a sign, as long as they're not physically harassing anybody or blocking entrances, they should be allowed to do so. Here we're talking about silent prayer. This is the bare minimum. It really is a shocking case.
Yeah.
Well, it shows that it is now an established principle that the state should re-educate the population in a progressive direction. Right. And in summary, and this is also, and this has been happening for years, people get arrested for mean tweets. In some cases, such as during the riots, some of them could be considered a form of incitement. But this was years before and not connected to any specific action where somebody just says something and gets arrested for it, usually in a symbolic way. It's not that they get sent to a gulag for 20 years, but, a prison sentence of a couple of weeks or so, but still a major deterrent. And it's almost always coming from the same direction. It's always the idea is you're supposed to be to have progressive opinions, and if you deviate from that, well.
Yeah, I think the real challenge here is to probably stand up for the principle, even when you fundamentally disagree, maybe with what is being said. Now, for the sake of balance, Harrison, I probably have more philosophical sympathy with the gentleman we've been talking about so far than you do. On the other hand, there was another story this week, the wife of a Tory councillor, who I think has been sentenced to 31 months imprisonment for something she tweeted before the race riots took off in the summer. And now what she said was, deeply unsavoury.
Yes.
I think, nevertheless, you think, really, a fairly long term of imprisonment for something you said on social media?
A term of imprisonment longer than lots of people who have actually participated in rioting, I'd like to add as well.
Right, okay. And that's pretty extraordinary.
Yeah.
Or a lot of violent criminals, more generally.
Right, yeah.
And I think one other angle here, which may be an interesting one just to consider at least briefly, is we're constantly told, aren't we, in political debates in Britain, that the European Convention on Human Rights is a massive constraint on government action in all these different ways. So apparently it prevents the effective prosecution of crime. Apparently it makes us completely powerless to deal with illegal immigration. Now, I'm open to those ideas being true. I don't actually know. I haven't formed a strong opinion on that. But equally, the European Convention on Human Rights contains protections for freedom of thought, conscience and religion, contains protection for freedom of expression. These don't seem to form any kind of binding restraint. Clearly they're not as hardcore as the US First Amendment.
No.
And they were perhaps never intended to be. Maybe the context of the European Convention of Human Rights coming after the Second World War, maybe they were a little less keen on far-out political speech than the Americans after the Revolution would have been. Nevertheless, it does seem that this all goes in one direction, right?
So I don't believe there are many cases that have been brought before the European Court of Human Rights, getting up to that level that have, people have successfully appealed against their censorship. The European Convention on Human Rights' protection for free speech is heavily caveated. It's caveated to the point of complete obsolescence. So you can't rely on that.
Yeah,
and that just kind of shows what the ECHR is. It's not a Bill of Rights based on any kind of clear philosophy or conviction or objective morality. It is a reflection of its time in many ways. It's a mishmash of classical liberal, progressive and establishmentarian ideas about what rights are and how they need to be balanced with one another. It's not something we can seriously rely on. And this is from someone who's a little bit more sympathetic, I think, to the ECHR, and certainly not very sympathetic to those who want to get rid of it for, deportation and let's cut due process short reasons.
Do we need stronger constitutional protections of free speech to kind of tie politicians' hands, to make them avoid the temptation to just kind of follow fashions on these things, or would it ultimately make no difference anyway?
No, I think we certainly do need some kind of constitutional protection here. There was a time when that was just an established principle that was just respected by, not everyone, but all the major participants in public debate, when you could say, well, an unwritten constitution is good enough, but it's now reached a stage where the principle needs to be codified in some way. How exactly you would do that, I don't know enough about constitutional affairs, but there needs to be some kind of deterrent where some kind of some barrier where you know that if you cross it, you're getting into dangerous territory, and you have to specifically concede new powers to the state, knowing that they will one day maybe be used against you, and where there is just a point where people do not want to go beyond.
Yeah. The Adam Smith Institute have actually done some good work on this, a British Free Speech Act, which I think would essentially create within British law American-style protections for free speech. But look, there's zero prospect that that's going to pass anytime soon. Even if it did, it's easy to repeal. It's a flaw of our constitution. I have zero sympathy for anybody who thinks the British constitution is a good thing. It's not. But at the same time, if we were to codify a constitution today, what would it look like? It would probably be some horrendous mishmash of Blairism and legacy Blairism. You'd be talking about permanently establishing lots of quankos
besides,
and much worse besides. You wouldn't have, the First Amendment's not getting put into any British Constitutional Convention today. That's not going to happen. So the best time to do it was about 250 years ago. We've missed the boat, but we've just got to change the tide of opinion on this because it's really bad. And I get accused very frequently, including by Kristian from time to time, being America-brained. I appreciate that American comparisons are not always the best way to go, but on this, I'm proudly America-brained. The Americans are correct, we are wrong, and you can see how much freer and better the discourse is in the United States, I think. And, in a country where we've got a very contentious US presidential election coming up, nobody is seriously arguing that people's speech ought to be curtailed. And even if they were, they couldn't. That's a good thing, and we should emulate that.
All right. Well, you told us what you really thought.
Yeah.
Apologies to all fans of the British Constitution who may be watching or listening.
This one got under my skin a little bit.
It has a few things still to commend it, I think. We can talk about that more another time. All right, well, let's move on to topic number 2, which is the upcoming budget. I think we've still got about 10 days before the budget arrives. Nonetheless, if you scan the news websites today, it's rumour after rumour after rumour about what is or isn't going to be in the budget. There was a time, of course, when leaking the contents of a budget was considered a very serious thing in this country.
Another one of those constitutional conventions that's just totally fallen by the wayside.
Yes, and you know what's interesting, actually, is that it hasn't changed since we've had the change of government, the degree of leaking. And some of it, yes, you can tell this is the government kind of trying to set out their stall or trying to manage expectations or trail certain things and see how they land. But there's an awful lot of stuff in there which I don't think the government, as in the elected government officials, are putting out themselves. I think a lot of this is just leaking out of the Treasury. That building just around the corner from here must be just absolutely full of leaks. as far as I can tell. And that is slightly worrying, especially when you're talking about market-sensitive information all the time with something like capital gains tax. But anyway, I think the biggest scare story, and I'll call it a scare story because I'm honestly not sure that they're going to go this far, but is that we're going to see a fiscal tightening, a mixture of tax increases and spending cuts, mostly tax increases, amounting to about £40 billion. Now, this would be huge. I think I read someone saying that this would be 3 times as much as George Osborne did in 2010 when we were embarking on the so-called austerity programme. So it's potentially a big deal. Where is this all going to come from? So it seems like the lion's share of any tax increases, according to the latest stories, would come from employer national insurance contributions, which apparently do not count as taxes on working people.
Oh, thank God.
Which, of course, is a bit silly in and of itself. Although empirically, the degree and the speed to which the incidence of employer tax contributions, payroll taxes effectively, goes through into wages, it can vary depending on a variety of factors. But most economists agree that in the long run, the incidence of payroll taxes is basically on wages. And so this is very clearly a tax on workers. Now, it's not clear at the moment whether the government wants to simply increase employer national insurance contributions or whether the focus would be on something a bit more technical, easier to get away with, which is extending employer national insurance contributions to employer-made pension contributions. How exciting, but actually quite a big deal. So there's the incidence question, and I think it is fairly clear, as I say, that the incidence of this tax would be on workers, one way or another, not on the businesses, not in the long run. The second thing is that it does seem very close to a violation of that pledge not to raise income tax, VAT, or, what was it, national insurance, the third one? Yeah. What I will say, though, in partial defence of the government on this is, first of all, oddly enough, employers' national insurance contributions are far from the worst tax in our system. I dislike how dishonest they are and how sort of stealthy they are and how they're used by politicians to mislead people about the tax burden that they actually face. On the other hand, this is a fairly broad-based flat tax that applies to labour income and so doesn't affect savings and investment. In the grand scheme of things, therefore, this is a relatively efficient tax as they go. The second thing, actually, is that not putting employers' national insurance contributions on pension contributions is a bit of a weird distortion towards paying people more in pension contributions than in terms of salary. Because at the moment, you don't pay the national insurance contributions on the way in, and equally, you don't pay them on the way out. So it doesn't fit into either the taxed exempt T pension model, which would be like an ISA, or the exempt taxed model, which is the way our pensions generally work in this country. It's a bit of both. So it is probably, if you were starting from scratch, not a feature of the tax system that you would include, not a feature of the tax system that you would want necessarily to defend. On the other hand, who is it that is making massive employer pension contributions in this country? It's basically the public sector and particularly local councils. So again, this seems a bit like a move that might backfire somewhat on the government. I mentioned a couple of other things very briefly. It sounds like the government is rowing back from ambitious plans on raising capital gains tax and scrapping non-dom status. It sounds, again, this is just the rumour mill, that they've been warned off it by Treasury officials who say actually this may not raise as much money as you think, or in fact it may cost money even in the short run. The other thing, which I think is quite funny, that's just bubbling along, is that supposedly a number of government departments and senior secretaries of state are basically refusing to agree spending cuts with the Treasury. And that's quite a remarkable thing. Just 100 days and change into a new government, that you would have serious disagreements of that scale on your first budget, which maybe doesn't bode well despite the government's massive majority, for their ability to pursue an agenda. And I do sort of wonder whether that speaks to the dangers of not having a very clearly articulated plan for what you are going to do, and effectively just winning an election by default. With apologies for that monologue, I wonder if either of you have
our tax man,
any reflections on the debate around the forthcoming budget.
Certainly not much to add to what you said. I think you covered the basis quite well, but just a few macro points. Agreed on the dishonesty of it, not going to do tax rise on working people. Rachel Reeves seems to be the only prominent economic figure in the country who believes that this is not a tax on working people, because it is. The incidence is very clear in the long run. I think for more on tax incidents, I think it's chapter 6 of our new primer on taxation, which we should link in the description, explains incidents very well, very clearly, and how the stated burden of tax is not usually how taxes end up. The taxes fall on lots and lots of different groups of people, not just the groups they're intended to fall on, which I think is a vital point that too often gets missed in these debates. The other thing I think that is important to touch on as well is you talked about national insurance as not that bad because it's tax on labour. We're also having a discussion at the moment about taxes on capital, aren't we? Which are empirically the most damaging class of tax. And part of the reason why proposals, which again, I imagine the government won't go anywhere near this far, I hope not anyway, to try and equalise or almost equalise the rate of capital gains tax to income tax. It's important to emphasise that taxing capital is far more damaging and far more difficult than taxing labour because it's more mobile. I think mobility is a very important thing to discuss it because, again, a capital gains tax is really easy to sell. There's basically an inverse correlation between the political popularity of a tax and how sound economically the tax is. Capital gains is one of those. That's going to have a tremendously damaging impact. And it's something it's incredibly difficult to raise revenue from because capital is very mobile, i.e. it will leave the country or has more of an ability to internalise smaller tax hits and to invest in ways to get around the loopholes and nooks and crannies of the tax system to avoid it.
Yeah.
So I think that's just an important point to emphasise as well.
And I mean, frankly, I know the debate is a long way away from this stage at the moment, but I'm not really sure that the main source of capital gains tax revenue, which is gains on shares, whether in listed companies or unlisted ones, actually ought to be taxed at all. Because really the share price just reflects the net present value of the future income stream. That future income stream will be taxed, just as all of the income that the asset has produced in the past has been taxed. Now, you can improve that taxation, I think, in various ways. You can make it more neutral overall. But actually, I think in an ideal tax system, we would really be ignoring the capital gains on shares in both listed and unlisted businesses and just focus on taxing the flows as they occur. That is a much better, ultimately simpler way of doing it. Of course, the other thing, some of the critics of capital gains tax are right, I think, to point to individual aspects of the tax where people are basically disguising labour income as capital income, where maybe the tax should apply differently. And I think that's one of the things that makes it a complex topic, because there isn't a simple all one way or all the other answer. There's a lot of nuance, because ultimately a lot of capital gains tax is about trying to police a fairly porous border between different forms of income.
Are you referring to Dan Needle's massive thread on this the other day?
I wasn't, but I did read it, and I thought it was interesting.
Yes, but so he addresses this very point about people hiding labour income, capital income, and I guess as you say, it's a very porous border, isn't it?
Yeah.
I worry that the way that that's characterised really understates how big a risk it is for people to defer an income and put it down as a potential capital gain. Anyway, it means that they have invested their money in capital. So you're talking about people who have just started businesses, for example, in the last couple of years, taking something down as a capital income rather than an income, so to speak. I feel as though this is a missed point in this whole conversation, because Daniel certainly did start a conversation about this on Twitter, and it seemed to me that people were overlooking the fact that actually you might be demonising people who take gargantuan economic risks by not drawing an income from their business by kind of talking about it in those terms.
Well, and that, to be honest, that's an example of where I think you're much better off just taxing the flow of income as you go along rather than the gain itself.
Well, just on the point of incidence, there was an Italian economist who wrote about this in the 19th century. I can't remember his name now. He wrote a book, I think it was called The Fiscal Illusion, and he was basically using what we would now call public choice arguments, which, of course, the public choice school didn't exist yet at the time, but where he described the various ways in which governments create illusions to hide the true tax burden, making it seem as if somebody else is paying. And playing around with the incidence, that was already one of the points that he mentioned even then, creating the impression that a tax that most of us pay, like employer national insurance, is ultimately that. A tax that most of us pay, you create the impression that it's just paid by a small group of people, and usually an unpopular group of people. Yeah. And in that way, it's that's why, even though in this case this clearly is breaking an election pledge, no tax on working people, well, working age people, this clearly is that. But you can create that illusion that somehow it's somebody else paying this, it's just some anonymous entity. And that's where ideally, in an ideal tax system, we just wouldn't have those illusions. So there would be no such thing as an employer contribution, because if it is so clear, and it is to most economists, that this is ultimately just taken out of future wage increases, or maybe part of it passed on to customers, then why not label it as what it is, so that the formal incidence, the legal incidence, and the actual economic incidence are the same thing. The person who makes the transfer should be the same person as the one who ultimately really bears the tax burden. So you would ideally just roll the employer side of national insurance into the employee side, merge it into one. But then you could also ask, why have national insurance contributions at all? If
the whole thing's on anyway.
Right now it's just become a second income tax. Yeah. It wasn't initially. There were some benefits that you were only entitled to if you did pay national insurance contributions for a particular period, and then the amount that you would be entitled to would depend on how much you paid in. So you had a contributory system, but that's gone out of the window anyway. That hasn't been the case for I think since the 80s or so. So once you've just turned national insurance contributions into income tax by another name,
I think
turn it into that.
I think fair play. One of the things that we have to say, perhaps as a kinder comment to the last government's fiscal policies, which we were generally, quite critical of over the years. I think Rishi Sunak and Jeremy Hunt genuinely wanted to move towards getting rid of that lie, basically, of that ambiguity, of unifying it into a single income tax. And I think that's to be commended to some extent. I mean, we have a ludicrous law in this country that I think we inherited from our time in the EU, whereby producers of oat milk are not allowed to call it oat milk in advertising because it's not milk, which really treating consumers like morons. But I think if we have a law like that, I think the government ought to be bound to its own advertising standards. You should tell us exactly what a tax is, who it affects, why you are doing it, and where the incidence is going to fall as far as possible. Because as you say, Kristian, employers, the rich, smokers, drinkers, fat people, whoever it is, when it comes to sin taxes and increasingly fiscal policy writ large, there's always another group, a demonised group, and that doesn't tell the full story.
I think you can even extend this one step further, perhaps, and say that ultimately the effect of all taxes is just to reduce the amount you have available for consumption. So if that is the ultimate effect, why don't we just skip to the end and tax consumption?
Oh, there you go.
Right? And you knew I'd get there eventually.
Yeah.
It's by far and away the best way to raise significant amounts of money, the least economically distortionary and harmful if you do it the right way. I think the only problem with just taxing consumption is if you put VAT, say, at 40% on absolutely all consumption of goods and services, people would suddenly realise just how big government is and how much of a burden it is imposing on their own prosperity and livelihoods. And governments would much rather avoid that. We'd want that, yeah. I suppose. We want people to be to have their eyes opened.
We're also consumers, aren't we? All three of us. Yeah. So, we probably wouldn't want that. But But it would, yeah, you're right. It would make people realise in a much more consolidated, impactful way, this is the cost of government, because we can't afford our government. And I think in large part that's lost on people, generally speaking, because of how sparse the revenue streams are and how people measure the impact of government in their own lives.
Yeah, well, I have a bit of a soft spot for land value taxes. I think that there should be, they have a role to play. So, but ultimately, yes, the principle should be as few taxes as possible, maybe a handful, maybe less, and these should be non-distortionary and very transparent and visible. And so we can see this now if you compare the popularity or unpopularity of different taxes. Council tax is, I think, by far the most unpopular one, even though it is, in the grand scheme of things, not that big a deal. I think it's something like 5% or so of total tax revenue. But it is a tax that, well, you make the transfer yourself and you get the reminder if you don't do it. And it is money that is in your bank account first, and then you have to actively transfer to the government rather than somebody doing it on your behalf, or the tax being merged and rolled into something else, into the price of something else, where you don't really see it. That's this whole fiscal illusion thing that this Italian economist was talking about already. And that's where, land value tax is one of the beauty, apart from the fact that it has no disincentive effects. It also has that clarity.
Yes.
All right. Well, I think we could talk about tax for a long time, and I'd certainly enjoy that.
I'm sure you'd love it, Tom.
Whether our viewers and listeners would, remains to be seen. You can leave comments to that effect. Should they have talked longer about tax? But, Kristian, let's move on to our final topic. You are recently back from Iceland, where you were attending the European Students for Liberty get-together, I believe. Did you find some young libertarians there?
Yes, there were some. And, I was positively surprised. I mean, not specifically about this conference, but more generally about the way European Students for Liberty have developed as an organization. Because, one of the upsides of being a perennial pessimist is that you sometimes get to experience positive surprises. And for me, European Students for Liberty have been one of those. That I remember when I first heard about that organization, I think it was beginning of last decade, I was, obviously supportive, but not hugely hopeful. I thought, there's basically two main possibilities. They are either going to be dormant, never really take off, because there just aren't enough classical liberal students. So I thought, students are either apolitical or they're Marxists, and there's not really a third category, or at least none that is big enough to sustain the student society on that basis. Or the second possibility would be that they would get taken over by sectarian cranks, that it would be full of Hans-Hermann Hoppe fanboys or something of that nature.
There are some.
That could, but not specifically in Students for Liberty.
No,
that doesn't seem to have happened, and that's a positive surprise. So they have representations in a number of, pretty much all over Europe, and sometimes at lower levels at various universities. They're well represented, run events of different on different scales, and I think they have adopted a model a bit similar to ours in that they don't have a corporate view. So they're just broadly speaking liberal, but they would not say we are an Austrian economics organization or we are a Chicago School economics organization, just like we don't do that. And that helps. Of course, people can have those discussions, which of those schools is right. I'm sure they have those, but neither side could claim to speak on behalf of the organization as a whole. And what they also do, certainly the conference I went to, was that they had a mix of, not just topics, but so there were some speakers like myself who talked about their own publications, and that would look very much like a think tank seminar. My talk is one that I could have given here in principle, but there were also people who talked about, for example, people who set up their own company at a young age and talked about the experience. What does that look like being a young entrepreneur? And that's not in itself political, but it has political implications that you can draw from it, that they face hostility maybe or regulatory barriers. And that just leads to an atmosphere where it's very non-sectarian. So you get the advanced ones who have read all the libertarian classics, but also people who are relatively new to this, and that doesn't cause a problem. And there is no script that you must have read before, and it's just a good mix. It seems to work. So 3 cheers for them.
Yeah.
I hope
Harrison,
this way.
you're our international programs manager. You know the global liberty movement quite well. One thing I'm interested to reflect on. My sense is that in Europe, this kind of young libertarian or classical liberal movement is doing really well.
Yeah.
Now, whether it translates into practical change at the level of governments and so on, that's a separate question. But I've been incredibly impressed by the number of people, the energy, and just generally like the quality of people involved in European classical liberal circles. Now, of course, we do have this kind of thing in Britain and in the United States as well, and across the English-speaking world. At the IEA, we run a lot of student programs, one of the most important things we do here, I think. However, I would say that over the course of my career, there have been 2 distinct phases in Britain, and it's more or less mirrored in the States as well, which is over the first half of my career, so probably like 2005 to 15, it really felt like that we had that same bubbling up of student libertarian energy in the English-speaking world. That all seemed to crumble away in the sort of the second decade. And just as there was very little, it seemed to me, going on in continental Europe in that first period, in the second period, things have switched around. And it does feel like young classical liberals are very much on the back foot and embattled in Britain and America. And to the extent there's energy on what you might call the political right, it tends in a more populist, authoritarian direction, not a libertarian one. But Europe is different.
Yes, I think that's right. So the first thing to address there is you talk about the Anglosphere, and I think it's very important to talk about that as a somewhat unified body, because I think a big part of this is our culture war. Now, the Anglosphere's culture war is particularly distinct. It's always American-led, but it has influence across the English-speaking world. And I've written a blog for it. It was actually you and I did a blog versus blog about whether we should be friendly with the right on the culture war. You said yes, and I said no. And I mentioned in that blog that I think it was written about a year ago now or something like that, that when the culture war began, about 2015, 2016, it looked like a real moment for classical liberalism. So I remember the intellectual dark web, right, of now kind of discredited group of people who all don't like each other, some of whom have become vaccine cranks, some of whom have become Trump cranks, and people like Sam Harris who've got, Christ, they're bad. But it was a unified group of centrists, liberals, conservatives, and progressives in America who all came together under certain common goals, like we are worried about the erosion of freedom of speech. You have people like Ben Shapiro, very popular conservative commentator, saying, hey, look, I don't care about gay marriage, right? You know, if the gays want to get married, that's fine, but I just don't want to be forced to go to a gay wedding. I don't want to be made to feel like I'm evil because I have some personal reservations against gay people getting married. Right? Hey, I'm for that, right? You know, freedom of expression for all, coercion for none. If you want to get married and you're gay, that's fine. If you have some reservations about gay people and you want to peacefully express them, that's fine. That is liberalism. But it collapsed because I think it collapsed under the weight of negative polarization. So as the left became increasingly sort of culture control oriented, liberalism, as has always been its failing and has always been why it's occasionally become a pipeline towards the populist right, is that it doesn't feel strong enough. It doesn't feel like a strong enough antidote to the enemy. There is such a strong temptation to think that politics is a game of winning at all costs, and it's a zero-sum game. And that if I really want to stick it to the left, who I don't like, then I have to be an edgy populist right-winger who wants to do to them exactly what I perceive them to have done to us. And that's the death knell for liberalism. So I think in the Anglosphere, that might be what's happened. On a more positive note, you're right. The continental Europeans are doing very well with their libertarian movements. And, you know, as I say, this is my job now. And part of the reason why I was so keen to do it when our former colleague Jack moved on was because I draw an awful lot of optimism from going to these things and working with our partners abroad. On one hand, because it's often very humbling. So, you know, now I'm back in Britain, my sunny disposition has disappeared a little bit and I've tightened up.
We've noticed.
But yeah, well, you know, just a little touchy. But I talk about, the country's finished, we've got no free speech anymore. But then you go to conferences and you see often heroic people of our disposition from countries like Georgia, from Ukraine, from Russia, from Belarus, dissidents against utterly evil regimes who are far worse than anything I think we can imagine in the short to medium term in the UK. And they firstly put it all in perspective, but they are also incredibly admirable people. I mentioned Georgia. Georgia's liberty movement is incredibly strong, and they are fighting against some very tough headwinds of a very Russia-sympathetic government that's increasingly authoritarian in their country. I think Georgia, I think Ukraine, I think the Czech Republic and Slovakia, Poland, these are places where classical liberalism is on the rise among the populations of those countries, and I hope we see a classical liberal future in those parts of the world, because if the people I meet from those countries are anything to go by, they're very impressive. We certainly can. The other one to watch is really South America. I mean, the Milei energy has really propelled forward a movement. The Brazilian liberty movement is incredibly strong. Likewise in Argentina, always has been in Chile. We have partners in Brazil, in Colombia. We have friends, unfortunately, in Venezuela going up against incredibly difficult circumstances at the moment in Central America, places like Nicaragua and Guatemala. That's also one to watch. And of course, Africa's always very close to my heart. There are some incredibly hardworking people there. Would I say that I see a lot of evidence in lots of countries in Africa that there's a groundswell of classical liberalism in the way that there is in parts of South America and Europe? Not quite as much, but I think there are some very impressive and capable liberty movement growing there. And so keep an eye on it in the next few years, because I hope we'll see a groundswell of positive developments there.
All right.
Just one more point on the pipeline from classical libertarian student activists to right-wing populism, or even further to the right. There is an author, I can't remember his name right now, I think a Marxist author, who documents these cases, and I think he does it with the motivation of saying, look, libertarians and the far right, they're really not that far apart. Yeah. There are a lot of similarities there. But I'd say there is a much simpler explanation of why you get cases like that. And that's simply, if you're a student, especially, and you are in an environment which is very left-wing dominated, you will get people who are drawn to ideas that shock others, that shock their peers, and that are seen as provocative, and where you just provoke, where you just get a reaction. And if that's your kind of thing, if you judge ideas not so much by whether they're right or wrong, but more what kind of reaction do I get, I can see why you would be attracted to libertarianism, but also why you would be attracted to the far right. That doesn't mean that there's any similarity of content. It's just that you get maybe a similar social reaction, and that's why you sometimes get this pipeline. That doesn't mean that there are any ideological similarities between libertarians and the far right.
And by the way, the right-wing populists, national conservatives are increasingly prominent in the intellectual spheres on the right, and they explicitly hate us.
Yes.
They are anti-liberal. It characterises everything they believe, that they are reactionaries against liberalism. So they have nothing to do with us, and neither we with them. They're as much enemies as communists, in my opinion. But I'm not wholly convinced on the shock value hypothesis, because when I was at university, I was never shy about expressing my views, but nor have my views ever been really motivated by a desire to shock anybody else either. And I got a lot of shock. Our ideas are incredibly alien to the consensus. They are threatening to the consensus. So what makes me question that? I mean, I can understand the simple theory of it. I met a lot of those types at university who had their view because they just wanted to stick it to the pink-haired wokies. But why would one go from libertarianism to a more collectivistic, authoritarian, right-wing mindset when I can tell you can certainly get enough shock out of being a libertarian?
Yeah. Well, I think it depends how much people's views that they express are rooted in a kind of an understanding of the underlying principles. Like, how much are they actually thinking these things through, as opposed to how much are they adopting postures to try and provoke a response? So, as you say, if you have a principal commitment to one set of values, it's very unlikely you're just going to pursue shock value by going off and adopting another one. If the shock value is the whole point, then I can see how that can happen. And unfortunately, it does happen from time to time, doesn't it? Where you think someone, well, they're a bit edgy, but they seem to be a good and popular spokesman for the things we believe in.
Yeah.
And then you realise, actually.
Many such cases.
There's many such cases. All right, chaps, shall we leave it there for now? Thank you both very much for joining me. And thank you, everyone, for watching or listening. Hope you've enjoyed it and will join us again next week. In the meantime, subscribe to this channel if you haven't already. Sign up for our Substack at insider.iea.org.uk. And for any further information about the work we do at the IEA, our website is iea.org.uk. Until next time, thank you.